welcome back everyone to our final episode in our 3-part series on stewardship. I'm Rosie, I'm a senior associate at Mills & Reeve, and I'm joined by an expert panel today. We've already discussed what stewardship is and all the different approaches. We've set out why we need stewardship in place early on and throughout our schemes. That was episode 2. And in this final episode, we'll be discussing how we actually put in place those stewardship strategies and the process of delivery. And so that brings me on to the first question for our panel of experts, which is, what do you think is the best vehicle to actually deliver a successful stewardship programme? And I'll come to Francis first, if that's okay.
Well, I think we've all been discussing the advantages of single entity, just reducing the complexity, making it more deliverable, all of those things, and holding that custodian role and the sort of long-term vision and value creation. So that's sort of been a part of our context. And I think we probably just need to turn a little bit to this very top-down approach, how actually we engender a sense of stewardship amongst everyone who lives and works in a place as well. That seems to me is very much part of the intention with stewardship, is actually it's a shared responsibility. That's in the ideal world, that's what you're creating, not a place that's only looked after because everybody dips their hand in their pocket and somebody comes and delivers the service, but actually people want to pick up litter or not drop it or look after things.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. Anna, would you say it's a take on that sort of one body but bringing in other people and communities?
Yeah, so I have this phrase of benevolent dictatorship that kind of like floats around in my head on particularly schemes of scale. So I think, as Francis alludes to, I think we want to deliver homes, and for me that custodial role, that coherent vision is key to enabling delivery. But this idea of benevolence is about responsiveness, is about engaging, is about listening actually of that lived experience. And part of what we talk about development and delivery, I think there is also a danger that you kind of say you do everything. And I know, Paul, you've talked before about the challenges of trying to facilitate and empowering a community rather than just doing everything for them. How do you spark that passion and that fire for people to say, actually, this is my community, I'm going to do this. I want to go and make sure we've got bins in the park and all the rest of it. So benevolent dictatorship, if I'm honest, I think is key for delivery at scale. But that benevolence part of listening, for me, is what makes a really successful stewardship, as opposed just to houses that doesn't respond to the lived experience.
And Sal, would you agree with this benevolent dictator role? I'm going to use that phrase.
I would add to the listening, which is listening and acting. And if communities see developers, councils delivering what they ask for, they think, oh, okay, they are listening to us, they are doing what they say they're going to do, we'll get involved, because they then feel empowered. And so, I would just take that.
It's about an element of trust, isn't it? That relationship between who's delivering and who they are delivering for. And I think this whole thing about confidence, Paul, that you talked about in earlier episodes, that's a key part of it. If you don't deliver, people don't have confidence. You leave this vacuum and you start to end up in all sorts of problems of resistance and I don't want more of this, and the conversation could be so different if you get it right from the outset.
Are you a master developer that listens, Paul?
Well, I've written yes, I've written down this phrase, safety net. So, and I think it's picking up on a lot of what you're saying, Anna, that the people moving in will want one thing, and if what we're aiming at is then the ability to create something that has this sense of ownership, where people are buying into a place and they want to live there and they actually want to settle there and do all the things that are really good, it needs something in there at the beginning to be able to make sure that you can say, well, while you're doing that and you're getting settled and you're building your communities, we've got these other bits, so we've got, and I keep going back to it, but we'll cut the grass, we'll look after these bits, we'll make sure that it's safe, we'll make sure the bins are there. While we've got that, then you guys can get on kind of creating this great community. And that is important. And on the one hand, you're starting to boil these things down into practicalities, But actually that's not a bad line to have as a way of approaching it, not least of which because it gives you the framework within which you'll understand where the money's coming from and where the money's going to.
Sally?
Just coming back on that in terms of, yes, need to create spaces, places for people to meet. We also need community enablers. So we need community development people to help build community capacity. As a new resident in a new place, you might be a new young family, or you might be someone downsizing. Whoever you are, you might not have the confidence to go and knock on the door of your neighbours and say, should we start that parent and toddler group, or whatever it is. So you need to deliver some events, actions, set up some clubs, test them. If they don't work, it doesn't matter, just morph with what the community do want.
Exactly.
And then those two things start to come together. The developers there cutting the grass and making sure the play area is inspected on a weekly basis till the residents are ready, the stewardship vehicle's ready to take that over. But actually over here you're already building that confidence and resilience in the community, and that's really important.
Giving them a bit of a nudge, I suppose.
Yeah, you're providing the space and the place and to have that conversation, to do those things, to grow in the direction they want to, and it's probably not the direction we think it's going to be.
Yeah.
I think there's always an assumption of knowledge, isn't there? That at some point you'll hand it over and it will just be okay, and it just doesn't happen like that, And I talk from lived experience. So I've only ever lived in new build houses, and some of them have been pretty challenging to live in. I'm a lawyer, I think I understand some of this stuff, but as a busy working mum of two delightful but slightly feral children, it's a time thing, having this community enablement programme when someone can say there is a parent and toddler group, or someone just to get that fire going, I think is so important. And I think sometimes that importance is kind of overlooked, because that is what will carry on that legacy in perpetuity. That element we talked about of sustainable maintenance in the long term starts very early on.
I think for some developers it's not the top of the list, and actually investing, whether it's 30-50 grand a year in 2 part-time community development workers as you're scaling up, actually will pay dividends in the long term. There are some developers that understand that.
And even Anna's benevolent dictator is going to want a way to get out of it at the end somehow, and that goes to all these things about how do you create and facilitate and fund something that is going to be able to generate that. These are rubbish words, but capability and capacity to be able to take something on, which will then be able to be run in perpetuity in the way that people want it to be done and is responsive and accountable.
And Abby, would you always advise your clients to have a master developer or benevolent dictator?
Not necessarily, and I guess my angle is one step before the conversation that's just been had in terms of advising a landowner on what the approach should be in order to achieve their stewardship goals. So it's fair to say every approach needs to be bespoke. There is no one size fits all. It clearly depends on the place, it depends on the scheme, it depends on the scheme and the landowner's objectives. I think is really important, but regardless of the approach or the vehicle, it needs to be, or at least enable, a long-term interest. This view will ensure that their decisions are justified in terms of that financial investment, the patient capital that we've previously spoken about. So perhaps that is a master developer, for example, who will plan and promote holistically with a view to enabling the delivery of the high quality places and spaces, residential, non-residential, really important that comes early on in the scheme. I'm sure, Paul, you'll vouch for that. But then also considering the existing and the new community that you're looking to create and ensuring they're at the heart of the process. There are other vehicles out there, such as hybrid agreements, for example. House builders obviously probably favour hybrid agreements more, and they can certainly work, whereby they're delivering and delivering the first phase to a high quality standard, setting the tone for the rest of the scheme and delivering the wider infrastructure, with the hope that they'll be selected to deliver future phases and creating that longer term relationship. Long term joint ventures as well are another vehicle, so there is no one size fits all. It completely depends on, like I said at the outset, the place, the space, the scheme and the objectives of that scheme and the landowner.
I suppose the scale as well, what's appropriate, not always the same. Okay, so hearing lots of positive things about a master developer and obviously other vehicles. And then we've also already touched on this about engaging with the community. So say you've now got your vehicle, your master developer or your landowner on board. How do they actually go about engaging with the community? And I'll come to SallyAnne first because you've already spoken about community enablers. So would you like to take that?
Yeah, I think it's always important to articulate the difference between a conversation a master developer landowner might want to have about planning matters versus community matters, and therefore stewardship, placemaking, community trusts, etc. Because they are different conversations, and planning conversations can be quite challenging, and what you're trying to create in your long-term legacy through the stewardship vehicle is a long-term positive building relationship. That's not saying planning conversations can't be positive, but they're distinct, and I think sometimes we don't recognise that difference, and they take different skills and different approaches. So that's the first thing. I think the other thing, leaning back a little bit to what we've just been talking about, it struck me when Abby was talking, is about, we talked about shiny new facilities early on. It doesn't always have to be shiny new facilities. It might be supporting existing communities. So there might be a church that could provide a venue for a parent and toddler group in the early days, and with a bit of investment of water and electric, for example, that could be a great community space. And I think we need to be bold and confident enough to say that's okay. It doesn't have to be on site right from the beginning. It can be existing spaces, and making sure we're securing them into the long term as well. You don't want to create too many spaces that then both fail until the community numbers increase.
Anna,
I'm going to be really cheeky here, and I'm going to pass it to Frances, because for me I think she's spoken quite eloquently before about making it not always about the imposition top down, from bottom up, and maybe you could talk to more experience about how that works and what it looks like in practice.
Listening to the conversation, I was reflecting on one of the tests really of a well-established place is how many clubs, societies, committees have come into being that of residents. It's a really good test, and you can kind of feed it, but when you move into a place that's been established for hundreds of years, that's one of the features that you encounter, isn't it? And we've talked a little bit about when at the end of the development process there's this sort of draw and the sort of cliff edge and the transition, and how do you get people ready for that moment to really get involved and take more ownership. And so looking for those smaller opportunities right from the outset may be one aspect of doing that, and whether they are community assets or even actually residential blocks. One of our working assumptions is there is a management company, but actually residents can manage their own blocks. They might need some training and support to do that, but they can do it, and in doing that they're taking ownership and control over a bit more than their home, and that's almost starting the journey of thinking differently about the place they're living in. So I often wonder why we don't support new residents to get the skills and abilities to take on management in a more sort of thought through strategic way, because it's an obvious opportunity.
Do you find that everybody's interested?
Not everyone's
in doing that, because there's always a bit for me about, I'm going to move into a new place and I might want to be part of that, or I might just want to know that I'll pay a bit of cash and stuff will get done.
Yes, I'm sure not everyone's interested. I suppose I've lived in both types of places, and there's different times in your life probably that they work and don't work. But through that process of being involved, it does mean that you've got a reason to meet your neighbours. And you've got more agency and the ability to co-create the space around you, and that has that may flow out into the wider place. I think and kind of release those energies. And I was very struck during COVID just how we saw people meeting their neighbours through that force of circumstances and then co-creating spaces around them, and sometimes in apartment blocks where actually nothing had really evolved. They were very well maintained, and they might have been there. The one I'm thinking of in Cambridge had been there since the 1960s. Lovely mannered garden. But it's only during COVID that they start to talk to each other, and it's only during COVID that they plant their first herb bed. The apartment block's been there all those decades, and they've not had a community herb garden. So it gives you a reason to meet people and a task that you do together, and I think that's quite powerful, but we don't give people the skills to know how to do that, and we make it very mysterious because it's a management company. So there's something about a transition as well. People aren't going to want to do it when they move in, But actually you could have a sort of cycle for 3 years and then you engage with people about how do you do that.
I think it's such a powerful point, almost this forced circumstance, isn't it, where you focus somebody's energy on something and that is the thing to facilitate engagement.
Paul, is that something that you find sort of challenge in actually getting people around the table, actually getting some people there to engage with the community?
It is. One thing I've thought about in the past is how do you get the passion and level of interest, I think that I suppose Francis is talking about, when things are going all right. So I think you can quite easily point at examples across the country where when something hasn't worked out, people will rally, not, against that, or they'll rally because of that, and there will be a passion that comes from that, and a level of interest, and apart from anything, people will be willing to put their time to something. And what we're talking about today is effectively when things are going well, when you have your master developer, when you have your well thought out approach to stewardship, how do you still get people to engage in that? Because when you bring it down, somebody will need to set up some kind of management organisation, and it might have a board of directors, and in the first instance you would expect that board of directors would be predominantly occupied by representatives of the landowner or the developer. And then you need that to shift over time so that moves to being predominantly residents who've got that interest, and that goes to Francis's point about how do you engage people in that and teach them and allow them to learn how you're actually going to do that. And I think one of the real challenges and the interesting bits is finding a way to do that when you're not able to sit there and say, the developer's been really bad and that's why I'm interested in this. You want it to be the developer's really good, and what that's meant is I'm now even more interested to be able to
I want to keep this up.
Yeah.
There's that ladder of participation as well, though, isn't it? We mustn't always think about governance being someone who's able to sit on a board. That's one part. Somebody can have an equal say by being part of a community garden group and having a conversation with their neighbours or community development worker that then gets fed up through to the board to make a decision to do something differently. So we must allow people to have a voice in a space where they are comfortable and hear that voice and make sure it's heard and acted upon, and that's really important.
And you think the best way of doing that is the community enablers?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I think there's some really great examples. There's a community development team up at Halton, and it sticks with me years into this. It was an Instagram or a LinkedIn post. It was the only guy in the WI, and it's so powerful.
Yeah.
And it's not, it's almost like we're trying to reinvent the wheel sometimes, but it's like you said before, Francis, actually those really successful communities that are already there, when you look at what makes them successful, it is groups like the WI or the Parent and Toddler group or a herb garden, and they're not huge, expensive, innovative designs or groups that we've not seen before, but it's just somebody there to help people get going, because I think sometimes apathy is a development's worst enemy.
Yeah. I think it's also scale, isn't it?
Yeah.
If we're talking about 10,000 homes and being on the governing body as a resident, that's a very different scale to being able to affect change in your apartment block or what happens to the neighbouring park. And somehow, whilst we have the simplicity of that overarching, we also want to enable people with as few barriers as possible to affect change in their immediate locality. And that's quite challenging.
Yeah, great points about community engagement. So I think we touched on this in episode 2. If we turn our attention now to the actual ownership of the assets and infrastructure, so open space, road, the scout hut, the building where the toddler group is, how do you manage the tension between those various assets and your traditional, one-size-fits-all service charge? I'll come to Anna first.
Yeah, so I think one of the most fundamental tensions when you have new garden communities is this move away from adoption by local authority. So whereas existing communities will pay a council tax and nothing else, a big tension that you have for new residents quite often is council tax plus private service charge. Realistically, I think a service charge now, is a fundamental part of making these financially viable in the long term.
Okay.
And so how do you manage that tension? I think it's a variety of different things. If you think about things early from a design perspective, you don't necessarily need all singing, all dancing community buildings that are actually going to be really expensive to maintain in the long term. A community hall that's quite simply designed, maybe with solar panels and that kind of thing, makes that service charge cost lower in the long term when you think about design at the outset. That's one thing you can look at. Another thing you can look at, for example, is charitable wrappers. If you put assets into a charitable organisation, they get certain release from business rates. They get access to grant funding that might not otherwise be available. And again, all that kind of additional capital endowment and lower maintenance costs goes to lowering the service charge. We're looking at a BNG. It's quite an emerging thing, so biodiversity net gain. Garden communities, more often than not, are well in excess of the minimum requirement for the local authority. So there could be an opportunity now to monetise additional units that you are creating and putting that endowment, putting that capital that you could potentially generate back into the management organisation, investing in the community, and again lowering that service charge. So I don't think it's an easy tension to manage. I think it needs some innovative thinking, needs some considered thinking at the outset, and just a variety of different approaches kind of bespoke to the site that you're looking at. But there are ways of doing it.
Yeah, that's like a modern version of the endowment, isn't it?
Be creative, and I think this is what Paul's point earlier about, no one size fits all. Public sector knows best for telling the private sector how to do it. Let's talk, let's listen. That entrepreneurship that you get from the private sector can be quite powerful.
And Sal, did you want to
Yeah, we always talk about mixed income models. That's the only way to make a stewardship body sustainable, because your typical community sum runs out after 10 years, and then what happens? That's why councils have stopped adopting, because they can't afford to. So we need to make sure that a stewardship body has a variety of incomes, that if one's on the up and the other one's not, that balances out. BNG is a really important opportunity, as are things like data trusts, Muscos, Escos. There are emerging ideas around how we do that, and some large schemes are already doing it. But there's other things, rather than cash endowments, it could be property, whether that's residential or whether it's commercial estate. But we need to make sure that we're doing that financial modelling right at the beginning as part of a stewardship business plan, so that all parties, future residents, developers, councils, other stakeholders, existing residents, can be assured that those assets are financially viable in their own right. And another thing we talk about quite often is that them and us thing. We're paying for our play area, and therefore other people from outside shouldn't come in. Well, actually, we need people from outside, because there's no wall list around our developments, but we need other people to come in and use the community centre or the leisure centre or the tennis courts and be paying for those things, because that's generating an income to the trust, which then ultimately, hopefully, offsets the service charge. So again, I talked earlier about a narrative. There is a narrative to tell around this as well, and getting it right is not easy. It requires investment and time and consideration and input by all the key stakeholders at the beginning.
And Paul, are you finding that on your schemes? It's a mixed model approach to the assets.
Certainly, and this bit that Sal just mentions about, we put play areas in really early in our developments, and some of them are quite large, and then people do come into those from surrounding areas, and actually you get this kind of, people are quite prepared to drive quite a long way to come to a good play area, particularly if there's a shop next to it, and they can, because that's something you can do for the day and spend a bit of time. So what I mentioned before about subsidy, so we're calling it kind of subsidy. So some of this goes to, where do you get the funding to do these things in the early days? And I think, Rosie, when you're asking about how do the tensions exist between assets and a funding strategy, those tensions will change over time. Yes. So in the early part of a development, and I'll just use a new development for ease of kind of thinking about it, but the developer, somebody's going to have to be putting in, effectively subsidising that in the early years, with a view to, over time, gradually, through a service charge, through your other forms of income, as Sal's talking about, you'll get that you'll get to a steady state, and then you're in a position that you can actually have, and surplus is probably the wrong word to use, because that implies there's just cash hanging around, but you'll have something that you can do something different with. One of the things you might want to do with that is repay the subsidy that you were putting in early doors.
Yeah.
So if you start to look at your stewardship body as something that actually in the first instance is having to go into the red to then come back into get steady state and then get itself back to the black later on, then that might be one good way of looking at it, because, and it's really boring to say it, but the money's got to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
One thing I'm really interested to find out now is, where do we put the income streams, and how do you acknowledge those as part of any kind of viability discussion that you might be having between a local authority and a developer? And biodiversity net gain is going to be important here as well. So if you've got a 30-year management responsibility for BNG, is that something again that kind of gets put into the viability pot, which is another one of those kind of realities of the discussions that we're having here, which is all good, and we need to get into that, but it goes a bit to, I think, what some of us have been saying here about you need a structure that's able to adapt and change and acknowledge and think about things when they come across differently than they might otherwise have done.
Yeah, about being flexible. Abby, is ownership of assets something that comes up a lot with you when you're discussing stewardship with your clients?
It is, and I guess it comes back to the selection of the delivery partner from a landowner's perspective, and making sure that they are aligned in terms of what the landowner is trying to achieve in the longer term, especially if they are a legacy or longer term partner in seeing the delivery of the scheme come to fruition. Sometimes the landowners might be located directly adjacent to the scheme that's coming forwards, and therefore they might be quite prolific in the local area and within the community, and therefore how the assets are managed for the wider community is really, really important to them, because it's a reflection of them. So it can be a huge priority depending on the nature of that landowner.
Great, thank you everyone. Yeah, some interesting ideas and solutions for management of assets, I think, there, which brings me on to the last question in this episode, which is, what one change in the sector would you like to see help promote stewardship? Again, a nice broad question, and I hope you're all going to have lots of different ideas. So I'll come to SallyAnne first.
I think mine would be about how we prepare our future planners, lawyers, professionals to understand what stewardship is, and to ask the right questions at the right time, and see that in our university courses for future generations of planners, but also the continuing work of people like the TCPA, you guys through these podcasts about how we can all work together to share good practice and share innovative ideas to support the stewardship agenda and whatever it's going to end up being.
Yeah. Anna?
For me, I would like to best incentivise and facilitate best practice around stewardship, and I think at the minute legislatively we're not quite there. So for a landowner looking to bring land forward for development, this isn't the best model to go for. Quite often there are a lot of dry tax points, so you end up spending a lot of money before you get a lot of money in. Like Paul's talked about, you have to spend a lot of money at the outset to make early delivery a reality, and you don't start to see that wash its face for a long time, so it's about patient capital. So do we have something around policy pathways or legislative changes that basically incentivise us to take a long-term view of development? I think at the minute it's all too easy to say, I'll go on, I'll build, I'll get off and I'll hand it over. Yeah. And I think we make it too difficult. We make it too difficult to make this the preferred approach to delivering better quality development.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good point. Francis?
I think I'd probably just want to build on some comments before, which is probably around trying to use the conversation around stewardship as an opportunity to talk about everybody's role as stewards for the area that they live in, and really have that as part of the narrative.
And Abby, what would you like to see change?
From my perspective, I think accountability is important, and it's something that as an industry we're getting better at recording and being able to highlight, I guess, from a data and evidence perspective. But that will really help drive and justify the decisions to adopt the stewardship approach that we've been talking about. It's something that our research team at Savills are working on, collating, but it does take time, and it takes an element of transparency as well in terms of that data being made available. So I think that's really important, and obviously the recent CMA report made certain steps in the right direction for allowing that to be available. But we've spoken about obviously the placemaking premium and the evidence base to obviously drive that decision making between the landowner and the partnerships that they create. But then that can also help, as SallyAnne has highlighted, the education piece, which I think is really important to justify obviously the wider benefits to the industry, that it's not just about the aesthetics and a place looking nice or pretty. It's way more than that in terms of the other value aspects we've been talking about, the health and well-being, the social community, the cohesion that you can create, the sustainability, environmental benefits, and of course, I have to say, the financial return as well. But the list goes on.
Mm-hmm. Great. Paul?
I think when you ask about what change in the sector would be useful, it strikes me that the answer here is in working together. Mm-hmm. And to achieve that better, we need better understanding of each other's priorities. Mm-hmm. If I, thinking of one thing, mm-hmm. if we can have that, and then we can all try and understand we're all basically pushing in the same direction here. Yeah. But let's understand better what each other's thinking and what their priorities are.
So managing different bodies' sort of priorities. Okay, I think that wraps up the last episode. So I think we've made some really good points about the various different vehicles you can choose for stewardship, and also how you actually go about delivering that and engaging with the community, not just from the top down. So thank you everyone. Thank you for joining me. I hope that's been really informative for everyone listening, and I hope our guests have all enjoyed themselves. So if you do have any questions, if you're listening, please do get in touch with us at Mills & Reeve. We would be absolutely delighted to discuss anything further. So thank you for listening.